Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 19. Mind Polarity. The mind moves on wavelengths of energy that vary with the causal alignment between emotion and thought. In this process, higher mind channels remain unperceived because of the difficulty with which the mind's energy field deflects the habit-forming thoughts or patterns that have marked its development. The reason for this is to be found in the mind's inability to put an end to the polarization of emotionally conditioned thoughts that have become the primary building material of the subjective personality. The unconscious mind is a lower self-experience until it has widened its scope of understanding beyond the ideational endorsement of contemporary society. Imposing a looking-glass of thought uniformity, society encourages the egocentric development of consciousness at the expense of creative centricity. This unconsciousness in the mind prevents the thinker from acceding to a higher thought register that would naturally bring a halt to the coalescing submental values that lock thoughts into rigid compulsion. The unconscious thought process creates polarity in the mind, preventing the self from understanding interdimensional reality. We experience the mind but do not connect with its supramental or creative level. We are unaware of its source and fight it throughout unconscious life. The mind becomes a battleground when we fail to understand its relay to other levels that strive to imprint on it a thought vibration for the purpose of eliminating thought patterns devoid of real meaning. We live meaning on an emotional level rather than on a higher mental grid, reducing it to a subjective value system that constantly polarizes the unconscious mind in an off-swing from reality. Polarity divides the self along emotional lines of force that dislocate the unity of consciousness, denying the self answers from levels that are free of polarization. This pressures the self into a subjective state rather than a creative or integrated one. Within the environment of thinking beings as a mass, evolution is very slow regardless of peripheral scientific achievement. Conflict arises from polarities in the collective mind that inseminate forces seeking to maintain the status quo rather than giving freedom to higher creative levels. For this reason, the psychic evolution of the mind can only take place on an individual basis. As an individual, man can drive himself beyond the limits of the collective memorial bank. The mind in evolution psychically distances specific individuals from the conforming mass. It is not evolutionarily sufficient to raise consciousness to a level of social usefulness. while imprisoning whole generations in historically polarized ideas. Evolving into a more individualized consciousness brings creative thought to the mind, breaking the barrier to communication with interdimensional levels. Self-conscious thought is transmuted into conscious communication, requiring a profound alteration of thinking habits of those who will have progressed along lines of evolution away from involutionary thought limitations. It is inevitable that thought expand its psychic function from the reflective to the communicative stage. Only the polarity of its emotional energy drags it down to the egocentric level of the unconscious I. As the mind increases its scope of consciousness, individuated or creative thought patterns deviate from involutionary habit, and it is realized that the reflective function of thought is part of a lower system belonging to a race that has not yet taken full control of its destiny. Interdimensional reality is only as far-fetched as the mind's limitations make it. Thinking is not an absolute, whereas interdimensionality is. We have been conditioned to thinking as being proof of self-identity. Far from the source of self-identity, it is a communication process at the highest levels of consciousness, and only becomes self-centered as its energy is drained by the emotional forces that underlie its psychic structure. Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" describes a primitive aspect of the thought function. Interdimensional thought has the telepathic function of depolarizing the mind, to open it up to its creative principle. Polarity is the outcome of the magnetic attraction of the unconscious mind to the emotional energy that gives thought subjective meaning. When the mind grows in consciousness, polarity increases to its ultimate stress point as it fights its way into the interdimensional zone of thought, meaning higher mental communication. The battle for egocentric survival climaxes at this point in the evolution of the self towards a higher mental level. Polarity keeps the mind in a false state of equilibrium. The absence of polarity destroys reflective equilibrium to create a new one, unknown to the ego in its collective thought experience. The breaking point of polarity is the barrier that consciousness must experience in order to expand into higher thought systems, where it can partake of unconditioned knowledge. The human mind is filled with polarized ideas. The UN individualized ego is unable to dissociate itself from their power because of the submental values attached to thoughts themselves. The individual mind has its own level of thinking, which in turn coincides with a more or less extensive thought register varying from culture to culture. When it moves away from cultured thought, it loses the psychological support which conditioned ideas provide. It enters a mental state that tests its ability to stand alone above polarized notions. This pushes its individuality to its limits, testing its inner resources beyond the socially conditioned ideas that nurture egocentricity and structure personality. The new man will have a mind that will lock into the future of thought itself. This allows him to connect to higher knowledge systems and adapt them, whenever possible, to his contemporary experience without creating unnecessary disequilibrium. Advancing within his thought future lets him evaluate the thinking system of his civilization and extrapolate new ideas that serve as a basis of perception for further personal development. Polarity, non-existent within his mind, leaves him free to know without having to prove. This creates, at first, a psychic stress that increases the depth of his advanced systemic thought register. Once he'll have consciously interfaced with higher thought systems and the pre-personalities that activate them from the mental plane, his egocentric consciousness dissolves and a real identity develops from the inner encounter. His mind is no longer polarized and cellular consciousness will have begun its work. That is, its regenerative growth process. The astral link is thus broken and the etheric connection established. He will have replaced his personality with his real person. Mind polarity increases the void that man experiences towards the self. It nurtures the lower mind functions and prevents the ego from taking on the psychological and psychic aspects of its mental structure. Once the mind has been depolarized by raising the thought ceiling, the self experiences psychic contact with intelligence planes that are interlocked with his own reality. He begins to see mental life as a more subtle process than subjective thought could have made him aware of. He soon realizes that the whole basis of subjective thinking is fraught with illusions that perfectly hide the cosmic nature of consciousness. The most misunderstood human dimension is that of thought itself. The condition of polarity in thought is what turns the mind into a fortress of lower consciousness that cannot deal with life as a continuum of energy moving from the etheric to the material levels of reality. The interdimensional life process is foreign to subjective consciousness. The involutionary being has never used his thinking faculty intelligently to investigate his relationship with a higher order that is in fact his own. Consequently, He has remained a prisoner of his lower sphere and dealt with life from a purely experiential or karmic point of view. He was born into the world without knowledge of his source or origins. Relying totally on the subjective thought systems imposed upon his mind through the astral plane of his consciousness, he has never been able to extend his mind reality beyond the speculative level. Thought polarity has held consciousness within the womb of civilization where race memory is the sole reference point. Polarity has so consistently diminished man's cosmic stature that he is long lost from domains of life and intelligence that appear incongruous to his rational misperception of reality. The polarity of the mind cloaks other dimensions of reality that give cosmic sense to life. Through the emotions of thought, consciousness is polarized and identity is lost. The inevitable consequence is the inability to regenerate the lower bodies with energy that is free from astral egregores. Evolution will bring to human awareness the fact that nature is not dictated from the lower, but from the higher mental planes of life. Involution has prevented the human mind from reaching the real dimensions of thought itself. Evolution will force communication with the gods onto the human mind level. Naive religions and materialistic sciences are a hindrance to universal freedom that is only achieved individually. In this capacity, polarity must be seen as a dualistic mode of perception that increases the reliance of the ego on collective values. Those values are not in themselves creative. They may be useful socially, but they are degenerative from a purely conscious point of view. Polarity weakens man's grasp of universal meaning, as it stresses the importance of emotions in the structure of meaning. As man becomes conscious, meaning will shift from an emotional to a mental level, no longer relating to the unconsciousness of the race. Meaning will no longer be found in the involutionary experience. It will grow from within and will no longer deform reality, leaving the self free from perceptions that disregard his identity. Polarity is a condition of thought that reduces the creative aspects of the individual mind to the level of mass thought reaction. It prevents the self from finding his own center. It alienates a conversant relationship with the thought adjuster, breaking the sustaining link with the pure consciousness of the supramental planes. Conscious participation with interdimensional reality is suspended while the self faces life alone, without inner help. Polarity imposes on the psyche a thought condition that forces the ego to speculate on the nature of reality, instead of being able to relate to it in a manner that would increase its level of consciousness, and bring it onto a plane of knowledge that would harmonize the physical and spirit or mind dimensions. The nature of interdimensional reality preempts any subjective interpretation of its cosmic laws. The self must be sufficiently mature to incorporate its principles without naively spiritualizing them, and thus preventing a clear-minded approach to its occult dimension. The polarity of thought retards maturity, as it forces the ego to rely on the positive-negative relativity of values inherent in subjective thinking. In order to apprehend interdimensional reality, thought must be upgraded until truth ceases to be a goal in itself, but rather objective, creative evidence of the psychic discovery of the mind. This is a far-fetched endeavor when seen from the purely scientific, methodological point of view. Thought polarity prevents access to the void which, by its very nature, can infuse the mind with creative energy unavailable at the subjective, polarized level. Polarity, on one hand, protects the ego from the shock of direct contact with the void and its higher systems of communication that relegate thought to a secondary level in the study of reality. But as such, it also becomes a limitation. Seeking dualistic truth, a hallmark of civilization, compels the ego to endlessly speculate on the nature of reality, which is one of the reasons why modern man, while technologically advanced, remains ignorant of the more ethereal laws of life, death, and immortality in the universe. Knowledge of other levels or planes of intelligent life within systemic evolution remains inaccessible to him because of his inability to relieve his thinking process from its polarities. Evolution depolarizes thought and raises it to a level of such vibrancy that the ego is no longer able to interfere with its universal nature. Involutionary memory is an unnatural barrier against higher thought systems. Memory is not simply part of the nature of mind dynamics but also a force that prevents the self from moving to higher thought systems, due to the emotional content of lower thought that he can hardly neutralize for fear of losing contact with his own subjective reality. The imprint of subjective reality accounts for total psychological security, regardless of the illusions that sustain it. Man is not ready to exchange his psychological foundation for a purely psychic one whose reality has not yet been confirmed through personal experience or collective communion. Moving from a polarized to a non-polarized thought level involves profound changes in the psychology of the self. Only through the evolutionary process will this psychological maturity be possible, that is so essential to the individual's psychic and psychological equilibrium, while acceding to domains hereto inaccessible to the human mind. As the mind is depolarized, The psyche gradually tunes itself to thoughts no longer bound to convention. It registers ideas that have no connection with the memory of the race. It assists the self in receiving ideas whose nature exposes systemic reality and its mysteries. This knowledge grows until it reaches a free zone wherein the mind is able to break loose from old tenets, never returning to its previous involution that denied the ego self-animation.